John Darwin was a 51-year-old former teacher and prison officer living in Seaton Carew, Hartlepool, UK, when his story began to unravel into one of Britain's most unbelievable frauds. On the surface, John seemed like an ordinary man, a father, a husband, a familiar face in the seaside town. But beneath that facade, he was drowning in crippling debt. The walls were closing in, and desperation was shaping a plan that no one could have imagined. On March 21st, 2002, John told his wife Anne Darwin he was going out canoeing in the North Sea. The sea was cold, the waves unpredictable, and when John failed to return, alarm bells rang. Later that day, his canoe was found smashed and washed ashore. Search teams scoured the coastline, but there was no trace of John. The grim conclusion seemed undeniable. He had drowned. News of the tragedy shook the community. Anne, devastated and tearful, played the role of a grieving widow. Neighbors and friends offered sympathy, donations, and support. For John's two sons, it was a life-shattering blow. They had lost their father in a sudden tragic accident. But what no one knew was that John Darwin wasn't dead at all. As police searched the sea for his body, John was hiding in plain sight. The canoe accident was a carefully staged lie, and thus began one of the most extraordinary fraud stories in modern British history. A scheme that would last 5 years, fool his own family, and eventually unravel in the most shocking way imaginable. While the world mourned him, John Darwin was very much alive. In the days after his so-called drowning, he slipped quietly back into the shadows of his own home in Seaton Carew. With his wife Anne's full cooperation, he began a life of secrecy unlike anything the small coastal town could have imagined. At first, John hid in a spare room within their family house. Friends came to console Anne, neighbors brought food, and their two sons grieved openly, never suspecting their father was just a few feet away. Every knock on the door sent shivers down John's spine. But the lie held. Soon, Anne purchased the property next door, a rundown bedsit with multiple small rooms. Behind its shabby curtains and locked doors, John created his hidden world. He lived like a ghost, slipping between houses through a secret door, careful to avoid windows. He grew a beard, altered his appearance, and limited contact with anyone beyond Anne. Meanwhile, Anne played her role flawlessly. She filed insurance claims, applied for pension payouts, and stood at memorial services with convincing tears. Authorities accepted her grief as genuine, releasing large sums of money that kept the couple afloat. To the outside world, Anne was a widow, doing her best to survive. To John, she was his accomplice. The deception came at a heavy price. John's two sons, Mark and Anthony, were devastated by their father's death. Believing the tragedy to be real, they stood by their mother, comforted her, and tried to move on. Neither could imagine that their father was listening from behind thin walls, alive but unwilling to reveal himself. For years, John lived in the shadows, venturing out only under disguise, sometimes in the early hours, sometimes dressed differently to avoid suspicion. On occasion, he even traveled to other towns, testing his luck with false identities. Yet, despite the risk, the lie held strong. By the mid-2000s, the couple's greed began to outgrow the bedsit walls. With the money they had collected, Anne and John set their sights on a fresh start abroad. Panama became their dream, a tropical paradise where no one knew their faces, where debts couldn't follow them, and where John could finally step back into the sunlight. But fate, and one crucial photograph, would soon tear their carefully constructed illusion to pieces. By 2006, 4 years after the staged canoe accident, John Darwin was restless. Living like a prisoner in his own home had become unbearable. The bedsit walls felt suffocating, and every day brought the risk of discovery. He and Anne knew they couldn't hide forever. That's when the idea of starting over abroad began to consume them. They chose Panama, a country far from prying British eyes, where the tropical heat, new business opportunities, and a fresh identity could give them the freedom they craved. With the life insurance money Anne had collected, they began planning a permanent escape. To make it work, John needed a new identity. With Anne's help, he secured a false passport under the name John Jones and began to cautiously step back into society. Their trips to Panama were bold and reckless, yet exhilarating. There, they toured properties, invested in land, and even posed as husband and wife entrepreneurs looking to build a new life. For a man once thought dead, John was suddenly alive again, walking freely under the blazing Panamanian sun, smiling for photos, even talking about plans for a luxury resort. To the outside world, it looked like a couple chasing a dream. To their sons back home, it was still unthinkable. Their father was a ghost, a tragic loss they continued to grieve. But Panama was not the paradise they imagined. The process of securing permanent residency began to draw attention. Documents had to be filed, signatures notarized, and John's false identity tested the limits of their cover story. Every form they signed was a gamble. And then came the fatal mistake. While in Panama, the couple posed for a photograph with a local real estate agent. To them, it was a harmless snapshot, another piece of their new life. To investigators, it would later become the crack that shattered their 5-year lie. Back in the UK, Anne continued to weave her role as the grieving widow, collecting payments and appearing solemn. But behind the mask, she and John were gambling with every step, believing they could outsmart not just the law, but fate itself. By 2007, their house of cards was ready to collapse. On December 1st, 2007, the story of John Darwin took the most bizarre turn of all. After more than 5 years of being presumed dead, he walked into a police station in London and calmly declared, "I think I am a missing person." Claiming to have suffered from amnesia, John spun a tale that he had no memory of the last 5 years, no idea where he had been, and no explanation for his sudden return. To the stunned officers on duty, it seemed like a miracle. A man thought drowned in a tragic canoeing accident had simply walked back into the world of the living. News of his return spread like wildfire. The press dubbed him the Canoe Man, a resurrection that gripped the UK. His 2 sons, Mark and Anthony, rushed to see their father, overwhelmed with emotion. For them, it was the impossible come true. Their dad, alive after all this time. Tears flowed, hugs were exchanged, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a family reunited against all odds. But behind the cameras and newspaper headlines, suspicion was already building. Police and journalists questioned the plausibility of his story. How could a man vanish for 5 years without leaving a single trace? And why, after all this time, had he returned so suddenly? The answer came in the most dramatic way possible. Just days later, a photograph surfaced, taken in Panama in 2006, showing John and Anne Darwin smiling side by side with a real estate agent. They looked healthy, happy, and very much alive. The image had been sitting online, waiting to be discovered, and once it surfaced, the entire deception unraveled. The truth was undeniable. John had never drowned. Anne had never been a widow. The grieving family was a lie, the amnesia a sham, and the entire story a fraud of staggering proportions. Their sons, who had truly believed their father was dead, felt utterly betrayed. The public's shock turned to outrage. The Darwins had not only tricked insurers, banks, and neighbors, they had deceived their own children. What had started as a desperate attempt to escape debt was now exposed as one of the most audacious frauds in British history. The walls were closing in fast, and this time there would be no hiding. By early 2008, the fairy tale of the miracle survival had collapsed into one of the UK's most infamous fraud cases. John Darwin and his wife Anne were both arrested and charged with multiple counts of deception, fraud, and money laundering. The scale of the scheme stunned the public. Not only had they conned insurance companies and pension providers out of hundreds of thousands of pounds, but they had also exploited the sympathy of neighbors, friends, and most painfully, their own children. The trial was a spectacle. In court, prosecutors laid bare the meticulous deception, the staged canoe accident, the secret bedsit life, the Panama plan, and the audacious return in 2007 with a fabricated story of amnesia. Jurors heard how the Darwins had manipulated documents, lied repeatedly, and constructed layer upon layer of deceit. John, stoic and unrepentant, claimed his actions were driven by desperation, an attempt to escape the crushing weight of debt. Anne, portrayed as the dutiful accomplice, admitted she had gone along with the scheme, but insisted she was coerced by her domineering husband. Their sons, Mark and Anthony, sat in the gallery, devastated. They had not only been lied to, but forced to grieve a father who had been alive the entire time. Their betrayal was total. In July 2008, the verdict was delivered. John Darwin was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. Anne Darwin received 6 years and 6 months, reflecting her role in managing the fraudulent finances. The judge condemned their actions as heartless, highlighting the immense emotional damage done to their family. Prison ended the scheme, but the damage to their lives was irreversible. John was released in 2011, Anne the same year. Their marriage crumbled, their sons distanced themselves, and the family bond they had once shared lay in ruins. John, unapologetic, tried to rebuild a quiet life away from the spotlight, while Anne later expressed regret in interviews, admitting the pain of losing her son's trust forever was worse than prison. The story of John Darwin endures not because of violence or tragedy, but because of its sheer audacity. A man faked his death, hid in plain sight, fooled the world, and then returned with a lie so bold it was almost surreal. But in the end, truth caught up with him, as it always does. The Canoe Man became a cautionary tale. Greed and deception may buy time, but they cannot erase consequences. If you found this story as unbelievable as it is unforgettable, don't let it fade. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with others who love true crime, and subscribe for more gripping real-life cases. Because the truth always surfaces, even after years beneath the waves.